I wanted to, first let me say this. Feedback is a good thing, right? It's good to get feedback on what you do. And it's nice when the feedback's positive. But actually, you probably learn more, and it's more interesting when it's not. I forget how long ago it was, someone who doesn't attend church here, but was watching the recorded messages online, left a comment. And he said that the biggest enjoyment he had with Pastor Dave, speaking of myself in the third person, was that he doesn't tell you what to think. He just tries to get you to think. So far, so good, right? That was pretty nice. Then there's the next line. My biggest problem with Pastor Dave is that he never tells you whether Jesus is a Republican or a Democrat. You can tell where this morning is going to go from here, right? All right. So, is that a joke? Is he just being facetious? What's going on? Well, then the next line said, would Jesus really have a problem with universal basic income? So he's getting very specific, and it's no joke. He's really asking the question. And you know what? A lot of other people are too, in various ways. We're just 2 weeks into a new administration, which is just spinning our country around, in case you haven't been aware or been paying attention. A lot of fears, a lot of frustrations, a lot of hopes, a lot of tempers. I'm hearing it all. I'm doing a heck of a lot of counseling, both formal and informal, with people who are trying to cope. They're trying to navigate. They're trying to find their way through everything that's happening so fast and so quickly. And what I find really fascinating is that both sides are co-opting Jesus and co-opting God into their camp and onto their side. It's been really interesting to watch that take place. And so this idea of whether Jesus is a Republican or a Democrat is not just a idle thought out there. People are actually bringing him in to their own side and then using Jesus as that higher authority to give weight to whatever their point they're trying to make. So I've been watching this take place. In fact, Wednesday night, we have our, I guess it was Tuesday night, actually, we have our conversations. Marion was talking about that. And this is just an open forum discussion group. And so anybody can throw out what we call the holy hand grenade. And so this person threw out the hand grenade is asking about whether the Episcopal pastor, the Episcopal bishop, who spoke at the National Cathedral directly to the president, whether she was justified in doing that in that setting. I really wanted to thank her wholeheartedly for that question. You can imagine the rest of the night was kind of a minefield for me because I wanted to make sure that at the end of the session, we were still all friends and wanted to show up and see each other's faces again. Because as you can imagine, there was a real diversity of opinion. And there's passion on both sides and every side of opinions, of situations like this. And so at the end of the evening, there was still no consensus, right? And I don't think anybody's minds changed. But one thing that was perfectly clear is that both the bishop and the president believed, or at least stated, that God was on their side, or that they were on God's side at least, or that they were doing God's will in whatever they were doing in terms of their policy and procedures. And so it's been so interesting to me to watch this play out and to see how we are gathering around our spirituality, but trying to co-opt it and give it weight to what we say we believe. Now, lately, I've been hearing and reading the question put kind of this way. How could good Christians possibly support, and you fill in the blank, whatever it happens to be? And this is happening from both sides. How could good Christians possibly support this or that? And then I had leveled at me this last week, how could a pastor, okay, we're upping the ante now, right? How could a pastor not feel compassion for? And then he listed what was going on in his mind. And of course, now he's equating and defining compassion by the policy that he was in favor of. And so there was a connection there between compassion and the policy. And it was a classic mercy versus justice argument, which we've talked about in here many times in terms of the macro and the micro. And maybe for those of you who are here for the first time, it's so important. This just changed my world when I first was brought into what the macro and the micro is all about. The macro being groups of people, right? At least 3, and getting the size of a nation like ours. And micro is one-on-one connections. In the macro, the highest good is justice, because the best you can do for a group of people is to make everything just, everything fair, everything even, equal access, equal protection under the law. That's the best that you can do for each individual and for the group as a whole. A group that doesn't have justice doesn't last very long in anything other than some form of autocracy. And so that justice is absolutely important. And this is one reason that the Bible gives us such fits, because the Old Testament makes God look so harsh and the New Testament so loving, because the Old Testament is a macro book. The Old Testament is looking at the relationship between the nation of Israel and God. And so the law is paramount. The justice under the law is paramount, and God doesn't come off as very loving sometimes, even though mercy and compassion is all throughout the Old Testament as well. The New Testament, on the other hand, is Jesus dealing with individuals. It's micro. And the highest good in the micro is mercy and compassion. And so one of the things that we do that kind of messes up the system is that if we take our individual mercy and compassion, because only individuals can be compassionate, an institution can't be compassionate, but an institution can be composed of compassionate people. But if we take our compassion and we try to legislate it into the macro, then it upsets the justice and everything kind of goes sideways. But if we take our justice from the macro and try to use that as a basis for our individual relationships, then we're just intolerant. We're unable to have relationships. And so this ability to code shift, if I can use that phrase, to oscillate between the two is absolutely important and essential for us, because we're individuals living in groups. And so we're constantly going to be like two sides of a coin being faced over and over with the two. And somehow we want to thread the needle down the middle and be able to be present to both of those sides and know how to move and flow between micro and macro and mercy and compassion. And so maybe to put a finer point on it, in the case of immigration, it's wholly consistent for someone, even a pastor, to have absolute compassion for everyone who comes across that border because of the situation that they find themselves in and what they're trying to do for their families, and yet at the same time still feel that countries need to have strong borders, a sensible immigration policy. That's not inconsistent. And yet, that's what is often thrown at each other because we are looking at only our own context or one or the other. We talked about this on Tuesday night as well. Like I said, didn't convince many people, and it may not be convincing you, but I wanted to just get that out there because it's going to come back later when we're talking about Jesus and whether he's a Republican or a Democrat, right? Blaise Pascal, if you're familiar with Blaise, he was a 17th century French Renaissance man, just a prodigy, mostly known for his theology and his philosophy and his mathematics. He has a quote here that is fascinating. He says, "Men, people, never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from religious conviction." I'm going to say that again. People never do evil so completely and cheerfully. Don't you love that adverb, cheerfully? It really says a lot, as when they do it from religious conviction. So why would that be true if you think it's true? Because God is the ultimate authority. And once you are convinced that God is on your side, once you're convinced that God supports your policy, whatever it happens to be, there is nobody who is more convinced than that. And that allows us to cheerfully do all kinds of heinous things because we believe that God is behind us. If you take a look at the history of the world, you know, some of the worst wars and the worst atrocities were committed by people under religious expression. And so here we have this ability of us to try to co-opt a deity to our side, but we need to be so careful. Because what does this really tell us? If what Pascal said is true, what does it really tell us? It tells us that the real enemy that we're facing, that we're dealing with, is not the other tribe. The real enemy we're dealing with is certainty. When we become certain of our position, it makes an enemy of the other tribe. And this is something that Jesus is constantly working against. Now, it's natural for anyone who reveres Jesus, or even just reveres Jesus' authority and wants to use it to bolster their position, imagines and wants Jesus to be in their camp. It's just natural, right? And many claim that he already is. Civil rights activists will claim that Jesus is supporting their roles, but so will white nationalists. Social justice revolutionaries or warriors, and also staunch conservatives will both say that God is on their side, both left and right. And it reminds me of Abraham Lincoln in his second inaugural address. Do you remember? We've talked about this a couple times before. This is right toward the end of the Civil War, after all the devastation that happened between North and South. And what does he say there? He says, both sides, North and South, read the same Bible, pray to the same God, and both sides invoke God's help for their side. Neither prayers could be answered. It's impossible. And none have been answered fully. And so this has always gone on. And yet, if we're so convinced that God is on our side, how much harm can we do before we even realize that we're doing it, because we're doing it cheerfully, right? Anyone who reveres Jesus also imagines that they know him. He seems familiar. He feels comfortable. He feels safe because we've co-opted him into pretty much our own likeness and image, if you think about it. But how well do we really know Jesus when it comes right down to it, beyond what we imagine, beyond what we want to imagine? Would Jesus really be a Republican or a Democrat? Now, if you know me, you know that I'm not going to tell you what to think, and we're not going to answer this question. But what I am hoping we'll do this morning is get you to think. Put some logs on the fire that you can watch burn and figure out where you go from here, and open up the way that you're going to be navigating the next few years in our country. With all that you know of Jesus, I want you right now just to imagine meeting Jesus for the first time. With everything that you think you know, you walk up and there he is. You're standing face to face. And maybe you've got one of those Star Trek universal translators so you can understand every word, all right? Because he'd be speaking a different language. But you're meeting him for the first time. How would your expectations of Jesus hold up that encounter? Well, first let's talk about the physical. Because of forensic evidence and archaeological evidence, we know that the average Galilean male in the first century was about 5 feet 1 inch tall, weighed about 130 pounds. Culturally, they had short cropped hair, short cropped beards, would have been very dark-skinned, stocky, round face. How different is that from what you had in your mind just now as you were imagining what Jesus looks like? Now you say, oh, wait, what about recessive genes? You know, he could have been 6 feet tall. He could have had blue eyes. Yeah, absolutely, all that's true. It's possible. But if so, if he were really 6 feet and towering over everyone else and had blue eyes and long hair, why do you think that the religious authorities had to hire Judas Iscariot to point him out to them? He would have rocketed his appearance. It would have been a whole different thing, right? Physically, what do we know about him from the scriptures? Not very much. Physically, he is average. If we look at Isaiah 53, he was even unattractive. Isaiah tells us that the Savior would have no beauty or majesty to attract us. Nothing in appearance that we should even desire him. It's so interesting the way that we have imagined Jesus and what the scriptures and the clues are that we found of what this really might have been like if we were able to just meet him face to face. What about his personality? Well, we can imagine from the scriptures and what we read in the scriptures that he would have been so fully present in each moment and each encounter, that he was unnervingly piercing. He could just see through you. His eyes would have been fiercely passionate in that way. He had a wicked sharp wit. He was wicked smart, too. Think about some of the encounters that he had and what he was able to come up with as a riposte or just an observation. Really, really sharp, really, really quick, and absolutely unafraid direct, funny, irreverent, uncompromising in everything. In fact, you'd probably think that Jesus just really can't take you anywhere, because wherever he goes, you just don't really know what he's going to do or what he's going to say, because he says what he believes, and he's totally unafraid and unfiltered to say that. His own family was embarrassed by him. They wanted to take him and lock him away, commit him basically, because they said he was crazy. And so he wasn't this soft and cuddly teddy bear. He was dangerous in ways, if you think about it. And he was an equal opportunity offender. Of anybody who was seeing themselves as self-righteous or seeing themselves as complacent, he brought comfort to the uncomfortable, but he brought discomfort to those who were comfortable. He was seemingly spontaneous and unpredictable. He would play with children, roll around in the dirt, and be completely undignified that way. Or he would be fighting with the Pharisees and the religious authorities with equal abandon. He could be tender and he could be fierce. He would never present what you expect. He would never give you an easy or a facile answer to your questions. He was always challenging, always. And just when you think that you had Jesus figured out, just when you thought that you had him domesticated, right? And he rocks you back on your heels. And for anyone with an agenda, he was frustrating, infuriating, unexpected, and outrageous. Now, does it seem like I'm exaggerating? Jesus was comfortable. I should say Jesus was comforting, but he was never really comfortable, right? He was always occupying a space just outside your position, just outside what you were comfortable with, always just a little farther out. Now, if you think I'm exaggerating, Jesus made his own followers absolutely crazy. And we can read that in the scriptures over and over again. Every time that they became certain of their position, he would rock them back on their heels. Poor Peter, he seemed to get the brunt of it. Let's take a look. Matthew 16, starting at verse 21. This is Peter at his best. He's so impetuous. I mean, it's amazing how after 2,000 years, the personality of Peter still just rockets off the page, isn't it? All these little stories, Paul the same way. They must have had the strongest personalities because they have actually been preserved for 2,000 years. Scripture's being copied over and over again. But here's Peter, so sure that he was sure. All right? From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer the many things from the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and be raised up on the third day. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God, forbid it, Lord. This shall never happen to you. But Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's. Whoa. Try to imagine Peter at that moment. How shocked he must have been. I mean, just dumbfounded, maybe in a bit of denial, to be so sure that he was on the righteous path and he was going to protect his Lord, and to get that kind of rebuke. At Matthew 26, starting at verse 51, and behold, one of those who was with Jesus was there with Jesus, and John's gospel tells us that this was Peter. So behold, Peter, who was with Jesus, reached out and drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. So this is the scene at Gethsemane where he's being arrested by the temple guard. And Jesus said to him, put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. And then Luke's gospel tells us that he heals the ear of the high priest's servant. But here's Peter again, so sure that he's doing the right thing, and he gets rebuked for it. And then at Mark 14, starting at verse 29, Peter said to Jesus, even though all may fall away, yet I will not. And Jesus said to him, truly I say to you, that this very night, before a rooster crows twice, you yourself will deny me 3 times. But Peter kept saying insistently, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And all were saying the same thing. And so all of his followers, they're hurt by what Jesus has said. Peter would have been devastated by what Jesus said, and he just keeps denying it. They're outraged. Their loyalty is being questioned here. Do you see how Jesus works? Also at the Last Supper in John 14, Jesus says, I have to go away. And they're protesting. They don't want him to go. And so Thomas says, well, at least show us the way that you're going so that we can follow after you. And Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. And no one comes to me except through the Father. And then Philip follows right on after that. Well, then show us the Father. That'll be enough for us. They need the certainty. Who wouldn't? Wouldn't you? Wouldn't we all? Show us the way. Show us the Father. Philip, how long have I been with you? And you still don't know? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. What else can I give you? There's nothing else to give you. There is no certainty that you're looking for. Whenever the followers became conventional, whenever the followers became hierarchical, whenever the followers became patriarchal, Jesus spun them around. He confused them. He outraged them. He challenged them. Take a look at Mark 9, verse 33. They came to Capernaum, and when Jesus was in the house, he began to question them. What were you discussing along the way? But they kept silent. For on the way they had discussed with one another which of them was the greatest. Oh, here we go. Hierarchy, right? I want to know. Which was the greatest? Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said to them, if anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. Taking a child, he set him before them and taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one child like this in my name receives me. And whoever receives me does not receive me, but him who sent me. Every time they think they've got it wired, every time they've got it figured out, Jesus is there to challenge them. He challenges their views on children. In that society, children were basically possessions. Children were not to be seen but not heard. They couldn't participate in anything. It was women's work in the home, not for the men to deal with the children. But he says, let them come to me. Do not hinder them. And then he gets down on all fours. You got to imagine, they're pulling his beard and he's giving horseback rides. This is not just sitting on the knee and patting the head. This is Jesus we're talking about. He was all in. First guy in the pool. Women, you were supposed to talk to a woman outside in public ever. And the women in that society were kept in the home behind lattices, and they were covered over, with all the modesty codes that they had. And what does Jesus do? He engages not only a woman, but a Samaritan woman in a conversation at the well. When his followers come back from buying supplies and they see him talking to her outright in public, they're shocked, they're outraged, of course. But Jesus is trying to get them to understand. This is a person. This is a human being with the same absolute rights that you have. And he deals with an adulteress in the same way, on and over again, women and children. How about wealth? Their idea of wealth was that if you had it, because God was with you and was blessing you. And yet when the rich young ruler comes to him, what must I do to obtain eternal life? Sell everything that you have. And when he can't do it, easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a wealthy person to enter the kingdom. And they're just dumbfounded again. Everything that they think they know, he is challenging. What about family? Family was everything in that culture, in a subsistence culture. And yet he says, unless you're willing to hate your father and mother and sister and brother, your children, and even your own life, then you can't follow me. He's trying to break down their main and first identity with the clan, with the tribe, that there was a deeper identity. And hate doesn't mean malicious hate the way we think. It just means to prefer less in that language. But still, to break that down. How about religious authority and the law? Everything in Matthew 5 is trying to break down and redefine what the law meant to them. And then righteousness in Matthew 6, he does the same thing. The purity codes, oh my gosh. He basically declares that all foods are clean. You want to know how that went down? It's kind of like the Catholics who couldn't eat meat on Friday for 1,700 years, and then suddenly Vatican II in the 60s says, oh, never mind, it's okay, you can do it. A lot of not too happy Catholics there. Well, they're not going to be too happy with him when he basically says, it's what comes out of a person that defiles them, not what goes in. Yeah, the purity codes have a purpose, and he kept kosher, I'm sure. But that wasn't the defining piece. He's trying to get them to see, to understand. In an honor-shame society, the way they were, he tells them to love the enemy. Can you imagine how that went down? If someone hurt your tribe, you were bound by honor to hurt theirs back in order to restore the honor. That's the way they kept things balanced in that culture before there were laws. Love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. He challenged whatever he understood, locking them into their small and parochial loyalties, because that what was keeping them from being able to connect. And whenever his followers became tribal, became nationalistic, became ethnocentric, he has spun them around again. Take a look at Mark 9, starting at verse 38. John said to him, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to prevent him because he was not following us." But Jesus said, "Do not hinder him, for there is no one who will perform a miracle in my name and be able soon afterwards to speak evil of me. For he who is not against us is for us." He's redefining tribes. Not by ethnicity, not by custom, but by intent, by the heart, right? Redefining. And when his mother and brother were told that when he was teaching in a house and someone comes and says, "Hey, your mother and brother are out there," he says, "Who's my mother? Who's my brother? Take a look around. These who are following me are my mother and my brothers." And so Jesus is expansively redefining the nature of tribe, the nature of loyalty, the nature of connection. And he does this himself over and over again. No one was more hated than the Romans at that time because they were brutal occupiers of Israel. And yet Jesus, when he encounters a centurion, not only does he heal his servant, but he exclaimed, he's astonished by this Roman. "Never have I seen faith like this in all of Israel," he says. The Samaritans, the next most hated on the list of Jews, the half-breeds, right? And yet he holds up a Samaritan as the one who, over all of the religious authorities, actually stopped and helped the person, actually was the good neighbor. Blowing their minds again, of course. Gentiles, the third most hated on the Jewish hit list. And he goes to the coast and engages the Syro-Phoenician woman who entreats him to heal her. And he does. There is no person that Jesus won't connect with. And so as we look at the evidence here, we look at how Jesus was, how he challenged anything that was becoming narrow in its focus or its form, then we have to ask ourselves, what belief do we have that we're sure that Jesus would approve, right? That he would spin around in us? Some of our beliefs run so deep, we don't even see how they limit or how they define us or divide us. We don't recognize it, which is what Jesus was saying from the cross, right? "Forgive them, Father, they don't know what they're doing." You want to talk about cheerful evil? He's being murdered on the cross in the most horrible way that man has devised. And yet they're spitting at him and screaming at him and throwing things at him, all feeling completely righteous and guided by God, justified by God. "Forgive them, Father. They don't know what they're doing." We have beliefs that are so deep, we don't know how they're limiting us. We don't even realize how they're dividing us and defining us. But Jesus refused to be co-opted into anyone's camp. That's not where he was going to go. And so, maddeningly, he's just always remaining out of reach, right? Can't quite grasp him. You try to pin him down. You try to make him take a side. Remember when they asked him if he believed that they should pay taxes to Caesar? They're trying to get him to take a side in a political argument. No, he's not going to go there. "Show me the coin. Whose inscription?" "Okay, it's Caesar's. This belongs to Caesar." "Then give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but give to God what is God." Do you see how he retreats from the macro and comes right back to the micro? He's not going to get bogged down there. He comes right back again. Judas reprimands Jesus or reprimands Mary for wasting all of this expensive perfume on Jesus' feet as she anoints him. That could have been sold and given to the poor. Where's Jesus' compassion there, right? You're always going to have the poor with you, but you're not always going to have me. From the macro back to the micro, from the theoretical back to the real, because this was a living, breathing relationship, and Mary was giving herself with abandon to that relationship. She's not going to be denied that, he says. It's amazing how Jesus maneuvers through this over and over again. Why? Why is he doing this? Just to be difficult? Just to keep us off balance? You remember what he said in John 18 when he was standing before Pontius Pilate, being judged. He said, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were of this world, my servants would be fighting for me. In other words, if I really were a political figure, if I really were a figure trying to operate in the macro, then I would be doing the things that you would expect me to do. I would be gathering power. I would be gathering military power. But my kingdom is not of this world. It's a whole different substance. And in a roundabout way, he's reminding us that the enemy is not the other tribe. The enemy is the certainty that makes enemies of the other tribe. See, we forget that Jesus is operating on a completely different plane. My book, The Fifth Way, was trying to articulate that and saying, hey, there's 4 ways that we can move along the face of the earth just to do the things that we need to do physically and to be able to survive and play to advantage. And there's 4 things that we can do. We can yield, we can influence, we can destroy, and we can exit. But those are the 4 ways, the north, south, and east and west of it. But Jesus is coming in a 5th way, a way that is an oblique angle, coming in a completely different plane that turns everything else on its head. And we forget that Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. He and the Father are one. He sees the world with the Father's completely clear eye. And he's unafraid to tell us what he sees, unafraid to hurt our feelings in the process of telling us what he sees. Because he loves us so much, he's not going to deny us the truth. I experienced this with that Franciscan priest that I'm telling you about all the time at intervals, Emery Tang. He wasn't afraid to get in my face. I tried to debate with him on some subject once, and he just literally put his hand in my face. Stop sign. All I can tell you is what I'm convinced of. You go become convinced of what you're convinced of. I thought it was a cop-out. Got my feelings hurt. Thought he didn't want to talk to me. Now I realize it's the only thing one person can say to another person. This is what I'm convinced of. This is what I'm telling you right now. You don't have to be convinced of it. Go become convinced of what you're convinced of. This is Jesus' MO. This is what he did. He wasn't afraid to hurt our feelings. But through that directness, I knew that Emery Tang loved me. He loved me enough to lose me, to push me away, to try to present what he knew I needed at the time. And Jesus is doing exactly the same thing. Jesus is always giving us the view from the Father's vantage point, from the place of absolute unity, from a place of absolute liminal space. And we've talked about this liminal space before too. It's the threshold. It's the doorway. It's the place between the camps, between the certainties. This is the place of paradox. This is the place of mystery. This is the place of true spirituality. This is the place that Jesus occupies because he is one with the Father. And the Father is that mystery, is that paradox. And if we're ever going to experience the Father, we have to move into that liminal space. That's what Jesus is trying to do, to bring us in outside of our certainties and our need for those certainties because of our fears, and bring us into that space. But that always keeps Jesus just outside our camp. And that's not always comfortable. I wanted to read a little bit out of an article that was written by David Brooks. And I don't know if you know who David Brooks is, but one of our finest minds, and he's been a New York Times columnist since, I think, God made dirt, but decades. Brilliant. He actually wrote this in June of 2016. So if you can remember back to what was happening in June of 2016, it was the run-up to the election that set up this last election, right? And everything was in turmoil and everything was crazy. But listen to what he says. In any organization, there are some people who serve at the core. These insiders are in the rooms when the decisions are made. Then there are the outsiders. They throw missiles from beyond the walls. They are untouched by internal loyalties and try to take over from without. But there's also a third position in any organization, those who are at the edge of inside. These people are within the organization, but they're not subsumed by the groupthink. They work at the boundaries, the bridges, the entranceways. I borrow this concept from Richard Rohr. His point is that people who live at the edge of inside have crucial roles to play. As he writes, when you live on the edge of any group, you are free from its central seductions, but also free to hear its core message in very new and creative ways. A person at the edge of the inside can see what's good about the group and what's good about rival groups. Rohr writes, a doorkeeper must love both the inside and the outside of his or her group, and know how to move between these two loves. A person at the edge of inside can be the strongest reformer. This person has the loyalty of a faithful insider, but the judgment of the critical outsider. A person on the edge of inside knows how to take advantage of the standards and practices of an organization, but not be imprisoned by them. Rohr writes, you have learned the rules well enough to know how to break the rules properly, which is not really to break them at all, but to find their true purpose, not to abolish the law, but to complete it. The person on the edge of inside is involved in constant change. The true insiders are so deep inside, they often get confused by trivia and locked into the status quo. The outsider is throwing bombs and dreaming of far-off transformational revolution, but the person at the doorway is seeing constant comings and goings. As Rohr says, involved in a process of perpetual transformation, not a belonging system, more interested in being a searcher than a settler. Insiders and outsiders are threatened by those on the other side of the barrier. But a person on the edge of inside neither idolizes the us nor demonizes the them. Such a person sees different groups as partners in a reality that is paradoxical, complementary, and unfolding. Now, there are downsides to being at the edge of inside. You never lose yourself in a full commitment. You may be respected and befriended, but you are not loved as completely as the people at the core, the band of brothers. You enjoy neither the purity of the outside nor that of the true believer. But the person on the edge of inside can see reality clearly. The insiders and outsiders tend to think in dualistic ways, us versus them, this or that. But as Rohr would say, the beginning of wisdom is to fight the natural tendency to be dualistic. It is to fight the natural ego of the group. The person on the edge of insight is more likely to see wholeness of any situation, to see how us and them, which seem superficially opposed, are actually in complementary relationship within some larger process. When people are afraid or defensive, they have no tolerance for the person at the edge of inside. They want purity, rigid loyalty, lockstep unity. But now more than ever, we need people who have the courage to live on the edge of inside, who love their parties and organizations so much that they can critique them as a brother, operate on them from the inside as a friend, and dauntlessly insist that they live up to their truest selves. Now, having read that, it does not mean that Jesus was tribeless. It does not mean that Jesus was campless, that Jesus was sideless, right? That Jesus was homeless. He had a home. He had a tribe. Capernaum was his home. He actually had a home. If you read the scriptures carefully, he had a home. Most likely his mother lived there and his other siblings lived there. It was his home, and it was located in Capernaum. And he was a Jew. He had an ethnicity. He had a nationality. He had a tribe. And he was a fiercely loyal Jew. There is nowhere in the scriptures that indicate that Jesus ever broke the written law, that he ever broke the purity codes, that he ever broke the dietary codes. Let's take a look at Matthew 15:24, where he says, Jesus answered and said, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He knew what his mission was for. It was for Israel. He wasn't going to go out and preach to the Gentiles. That was Paul's job eventually. Jesus was fiercely loyal, and he was absolutely Jewish. At the same time, did he have any political aspirations? Apparently not. Did he have any political philosophy or beliefs? I'm sure he did. The Roman occupation of his homeland was absolutely brutal, absolutely unfair. He must have had some thoughts about that. He must have realized how wrong it was, how brutal it was. But it never stopped him from being able to be fully present in the moment to a Roman himself, to anybody else. He was able to eat, drink, and be merry. He was called a drunkard and a glutton by those who opposed him because he had a good time. He laughed, he ate, he drank, even though he saw what was wrong around him, even though in the macro he knew all the things that were heinous and atrocious in his world. But he could still live his micro life because his identity was with the Father first. He saw all of Israel and all politics from that vantage point, which kept him on the edge of inside. He was the first to criticize his own people, his own system. And he was the first to praise the other systems around him, but also vice versa when that was appropriate. And so for all of us, what do we learn from this? Because as long as we identify with our tribe, our party first, our church first, we're never going to understand Jesus. And we're never going to really find comfort with him. We have to understand that politics is unapologetically and necessarily dualistic. It's not unitive in that respect. It's dualistic. It has to be. Politics does not seek agreement within the group. It's not possible to get agreement in a group. Have you ever tried? In a church, do we actually agree theologically about anything? Do we agree politically about anything? It's not even possible, and it's not the point of politics. Politics seeks only to manage and balance the agendas and the actions of the various power groups within the community, within the nation. That's what politics is about, managing power groups. It works to manage the tensions in this world of diversity and to maintain that diversity, but also to create symbiosis. That's the mutually beneficial relationship between the different groups that can take place. Kind of like the clownfish and the sea anemone. Remember symbiosis, right? Politics is trying to develop that symbiotic relationship. But it's not the same as agreement, and it's really not even the same as unity. But it's the best that we can do in the macro. There's that macro word again. Jesus is working in the micro. One-on-one, trying to turn individual heart lights on, where full unity and oneness is not only possible, but it's absolutely necessary for kingdom. If and when we can step outside of our egoic consciousness, the tribalism that is always going to seek agreement or conformity instead of real unity. And so it really misses the point to imagine Jesus working on the macro political stage, that he would be on one side or another, setting one tribe against another. If Jesus had any political beliefs, they're not recorded for us, which means that they're not important for us. They're non-essential to the content of his message. And it doesn't mean that he had none, but from whichever platform Jesus chose to work, as a Jew or anything else, whether he was Jewish or Gentile, Republican or Democrat, he would equally comfort and frustrate both camps, because that's who he was, always still on the edge of inside, always still occupying liminal space. You know, it's fascinating to me that if you go back to Exodus 33, the custom of Moses at the time when the Jews were still in the desert, before they had any set homeland, the tent of meeting that they would set up where God would meet Moses and meet anyone who wanted to pray with him was set a far distance outside of the camp. It wasn't in the camp, it was outside the camp. If you wanted to go meet God, you had to journey outside of the camp to get there. They did this on purpose, of course. No one could co-opt God. No one tribe owned God. The tent of meeting was outside the camp. And so if you want to meet Jesus, you're going to have to go outside your camp, outside your tribe, outside your party, outside your embedded beliefs. You're going to need to sell everything that you think you know and you're clinging to in order to really meet Jesus. And so for the rest of this year, maybe the next 4 years, it's going to be a bumpy ride. Am I quoting Betty Davis here? It's going to be a bumpy ride. And how we are able to navigate this is going to equal how well we're able to follow Jesus' example. If we can only find security, purpose in our own party, in our own camp, then we'll be missing Jesus entirely and what he's trying to tell us. If we're asking whether Jesus is a Republican or a Democrat to try to justify our own position, then prepare to be frustrated, because he's not going to answer such a question. And if we're looking for Jesus to be our North Star, to point the way for us, then be prepared to be led way outside your camp, because that's where Jesus is going to take you every single time. Jesus is all about selling everything that you have. He's about letting go of anything that limits you, anything that limits your ability to come to full connection with everyone and anyone that you encounter, regardless of who they come from, where they come from, regardless of what they believe. Because Jesus knows the real enemy is not the other tribe. The real enemy is the certainty that we can develop that makes enemies of the other tribe and takes us right out of the unity of kingdom. Let's pray. Father, this is a bumpy ride. This is very difficult for so many of us. There's so much change coming so quickly. There's so much fear. There's so much uncertainty that we're grasping. Help us to take a deeper breath. Help us to hang on to who you are, to identify with you first, and see how that rearranges our ability to navigate the ins and outs of daily life and political practice. We want to be positive influences in the life of our community and our nation. We don't want to sit at the sidelines. We want to have passionate beliefs, but we also want to be solution and not just another part of the problem. Help us to move to the inside, the edge of inside, to that liminal space, so we can see more clearly the choices that need to be made, and more importantly, our response to the choices that are being made. We want to be positive influencers in our communities, in our families, and all our relationships. So help us, Lord, with that. Help us to find that space. Continue to be our North Star. Continue to guide and show us. And give us the grace to be able to let go of embedded beliefs when we need to and submit to something different. Thank you, Lord, for everything that you've given us. Thank you for our very lives and our breath. Never let us forget we can only love because you loved us first. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's all stand.